So our speaker tonight, John Ross, he's quite a guy. He's a historian, he's a writer, he's a whitewater enthusiast, he's an adventurer, and he's a former editor, American Heritage, Smithsonian magazines, written over 200 articles. He's been in Smithsonian Magazine, the Atlantic, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Outside Magazine, Washington Post, reported from Greenland, Siberia, Galapagos, Panama, Thailand, Mexico. In addition to his written work, he's been featured on more than 50 radio and television programs, including PBS's American Experience, NPR's On Point, Science Friday, C-SPAN, Discovery Channel. He's spoken to Smithsonian's Natural History Museum, NASA, Explorers Club, and Wesley Powell's old club, the Cosmos Club. His books include Enduring Courage, Ace Pilot Eddie Rickenbacker and the Dawn of the Age of Speed, War on the Run, the epic story of Robert Rogers, The Conquest of America's Frontier. That book won the 2011 Fort Ticonderoga Award for contributions to American history. His fifth book, Promise of the Grand Canyon, John Wesley Powell's perilous journey and his vision for the American West, subject of tonight's talk. So, on a personal note, I picked up the Promise of the Grand Canyon, and I just wanted to at least scan it so I understood what we were talking about tonight. But I couldn't put it down. I found myself irresistibly drawn deeply into the story, and even seeking more information about John Wesley Powell. This book's a good read. It just kind of pulls you in with good writing, and it's a great story. In addition, this Major Powell's many-faceted life and the significance of his findings and his beliefs and the way he went about his life kept me glued to the pages and made me really wish that he was with us today to help us through this maze of global climate change that we're through. He lived, I tell you, the latter part of the 19th century was really familiar. It really sounded a lot like our days of politically and people's beliefs. And it's rough for him, it's rough for us, but it would have been nice to have his advice. So I'm really looking forward to Mr. Ross's remarks, and I highly recommend that you seek out this highly readable and fascinating and really quite pertinent to our times book. The book will be available for sale and signing after the show.
Thank you, Jim, for those lovely words, and thank you all for coming out tonight. Here in Zoom land, hello. Just want to thank the director, Elric, for inviting us, and Kathy for setting this up, Katie for doing yeoman's work on tech stuff, and my wife Diana, and some familiar faces here, Leslie and Richard, for hosting us here tonight. Thank you all for coming out on this beautiful day. I want to tell a few stories about a remarkable man that I wrote a book about, John Wesley Powell, and I hope at the end you'll come away with a sense about who he was. If 120 years ago, if you were involved in some of the summer colony, you came up here during the summer here, particularly in Brooklyn, where he built a house in the latter part of his life. It was right at the end of the 20th century, where he built a house. You would have seen him walking down the street, and you would have known who he was. Everybody knew who he was. Everybody had an opinion about this man, for good and for bad. He was that kind of person. And you see him coming down the road, first thing that would strike, he wasn't a very physically imposing person. He was about 5'6", but you'd see that he had only one arm, his right arm, that was lost. Big salt and pepper beard. And you'd come up to him and you'd go, well, what is this person about? And you'd look into his gray eyes and you'd go, wow, there is something here. He'd grip you with his left arm hard, and he'd look at you, and you'd talk. And one of the things that's so interesting about John Wesley Powell, wherever he went, this is what attracted me in the first place. As I worked at the Smithsonian as a member of the Cosmos Club, I did a lot of exploration. I'd be tripping over everywhere, over in ethnography about his work in American Indian languages and his exploration and his work in mapping and his work in water conservation. And you're wondering, wow, what was this guy all about? Well, if he was here right now, he would be so interested in what we're talking about today and who you all were. And that's when he would really focus his laser attention on you and want to know what his door was always open. Up here in Brooklyn, he established the Owl Club, and it was a bunch of Washingtonians who just wanted to get together and talk about things of interest. You know, he just was that kind of guy. Let me tell you a little bit about him. And I don't want you to use your imagination at first a little bit here. I want to take you back to May of 1869. It's just after the Civil War, right? So, but imagine you're in the southern Wyoming territory. It's flat, it's hot, there are naked buttes. You're in the little town of Green River. It's just a little bit of just a know-nothing town with a bunch of beaten-up adobe buildings. Just over the border from the Utah Territory. The Green River is not green at all. It's brown and sluggish. There's a railroad trestle that crosses the Green River. But you're in the middle of nowhere. But on a spit of land about a mile south, a couple willow trees, there's a large pile of supplies, and you would see 4 narrow rowboats. And moving about them were a group of 10 men. Most of them wear their hair in long and greasy. They have a don't give a damn swagger about them. Their eyes are bloodshot from 2 weeks of drinking the town's homemade hooch, which is known as 40 rod, because evidently if you drink it, you can't walk more than 200 yards before you fall over it. You know, and these guys, they bear marks of a hard life on the frontier, scars from Indian arrows and close encounters with grizzly bears. They've survived starvation, falls, near drowning, mule kicks. It's a tough lot. It's not exactly the kind of men you would think of choosing to undergo one of the toughest and most remarkable expeditions in American history, rowing down the Green and Colorado rivers through some of the most inhospitable land in the world, including the Grand Canyon. But maybe in a peculiar way, they were perfect for it. And at the center of it, of course, who started the whole thing, visualized it, plotted it out, was our friend John Wesley Powell. He had lost his right arm as an artillery commander at the Battle of Shiloh at the Hornet's Nest. If you recall that, it's one of the most intense battle scenes in the entire Civil War. He was commanding an artillery regiment, and he raised his right arm in the thick of it to signal his crew to fire, and a shrapnel took off his right arm. After a little bit, just touch of background, after the Civil War, everybody was ready to get back to the business of business. You know, that was what America was about. A lot of eyes turned to the West, of course, because there was just such possibility for development. All of continental America pretty much at that point had been explored, with the exception of a 100 by 300 mile piece of geography. It's like a jigsaw puzzle that lay within the Colorado Plateau. The Colorado Plateau, which you can see the four corners here of the 4 states. They weren't states then, but right in here. It's the second highest plateau in the world, second to only to one in Tibet. This, you'll know, it looks like a beating heart to me, but we know this today as the place where Bryce Canyon, Zion, Capitol Reef, and of course the Grand Canyon is. And if you've been out there, you will understand that it's not a place that you walk from one place to another. It's cracked with huge, mile deep chasms, and it's arid, and it's just very difficult to negotiate. So this was the last piece in what, Lewis and Clark had begun some 70 years before, and Powell had set out to try to pierce this, to map it, and to understand what it was about. And the way he wanted to do it was to run the Colorado River through the heart of the Grand Canyon. Now, the only problem was they didn't know anything about the Colorado River, what it did, where it went. The only thing he knew was they would start out in Green River at 6,000 feet. And by the time they came out of the Grand Canyon and dropped off the plateau, they would be at 0. 6,000 feet. Now, they didn't know if the river meandered gently and it was a nice, even, gradual thing, or was it punctuated by terrible man-eating falls? No one knew. So that's what he was kind of contemplating. The Native Americans who had been in the area talked about how the river would be sucked underground for miles at a time. But no question that there was cataclysmic whitewater in there. Even Charles Fremont, and he was, of course, no stranger to terrible privation and exploration, he considered passage down the Colorado River suicide. But Powell was a stubborn human being, as we'll learn. He packed 10 months of provisions, including, not going to believe it, barrels of nails and some hammers to build a cabin to overwinter. He expected to maybe encounter some ice on the Colorado. Well, that was the least of his problems. That's how much they didn't know. People knew more about the surface of the moon than they did about what was in this area. And John Wesley Powell, he was not kind of your average kind of, he wasn't a glory hound or your run-of-the-mill explorer. He was a scientist, a geologist, largely self-taught. And he knew that the canyon represented one of the greatest scientific opportunities of this generation, probably even longer than that. Geologists for some time had been studying the Earth's features, but they had been limited largely to seeing cross sections of the Earth exposed in stream banks, maybe a couple 100 feet, right? Here was a promise of really seeing some parts of Earth's history that nobody had ever really looked at before. And so kind of the basis, I mentioned about his curiosity, that was really the core of what drew him into the maw of this terrible challenge which was ahead of him. He would be like a kid in a candy shop, but metaphor kind of drops after a little bit because it would nearly kill him and it would kill some of his expedition members. So after the Civil War, as we were talking about business, one of the great things, of course, that happened that really catalyzed so many things was the crossing of the United States by the Continental Railroad, right, in 1869. So that railroad trestle that I just talked that crossed Green River, well, that was the Continental Railroad. And this, for Powell, set it all up because he realized that he could bring his own boats and not bring boats, make boats on the side of the river. He could bring boats that he had specially built. He selected Whitehulls, and Whitehulls are narrow rowboats. They were built originally in Chicago, and they were built to ferry people and supplies to ships. They were fast. They're using New York Harbor. The police ended up using them in harbor patrol because they were fast. Nobody knew about whitewater, negotiating whitewater. If you know about whitewater at all, you can imagine there are rock gardens, right? And you don't want to be too fast. You want to be nimble to move around so you don't get caught. So these were not, didn't really know, but not particularly the best choice. And in addition, it's interesting now when you see pictures of people going down the Colorado River, a lot of whitewater, they're facing downriver, and they do that. This was, again, something that seems commonsensical today, but no, these guys were rowing backwards on this. This is a picture, it's a little later, but you'll notice this chair. It's a captain's chair, bolted to the deck, and Powell, in the worst rapids, would sit in it, and they would tie him down with ropes, because he only had one arm. So that gives you a little bit of a sense. You can also see here that the bulkheads are filled over, so he did take, he had these carefully built, so the beams of the boats were reinforced. He had waterproof bulkheads. He split the supplies up between, he had 4 boats and a smaller scout boat. So he split up the supplies, so if one got lost, they wouldn't be, they wouldn't lose all of their material. So he split up his compasses and his barometers and, his surveying equipment between that. 2, he even planned a flag system so that, the scouting boat could flag people over in case of really hard water. But as we all know, the best planning doesn't always work in the real world. A mere 2 weeks into the trip, the crew of one of the boats didn't see or ignored Powell was on the side of the, had scouted this one particularly bad rapid that they just come up on, flagging them over. And one of the guys, I think he was a little, he thought he could just kind of do the water and didn't really need to pay attention. They went shooting right in to the rapids. They were taking on water already. When they realized that they were just about to get into the soup, they tried to move in the boat. It just was too much. And it just in a moment, everything fell apart in the thunder of whitewater. The boat smashed into a rock and split in 2. The 3 guys were thrown out. They held onto one piece of it in thrashing water. And somehow they managed to cling on to that broken hull. That piece of the boat hit another rock. That splintered. Miraculously, the men ended up on a very thin spit of sandy shoal. And in a heartbeat, the rest of all of the boat had been reduced to matchbook size pieces. That's in the sense of the water. They lost everything that they owned, including most of the clothes they were wearing. One man only sported bright red long underwear bottoms. It had dropped down to his ankles and it almost drowned him. He sat, and these are all taken from descriptions in some of the journals. He sat on the spit, just terrified, like he had seen a ghost. Kind of thing maybe he had. Gone was a third of their supplies. And although Powell kind of planned for this, it had cut into their margin, right? Cut that down. One more kind of catastrophe would be real trouble for them. They were getting to the point of no return when the rock walls would just really not let many chances for people to get out, so they would just have to be in it. And the whitewater that they just experienced wasn't anything compared to what they were going to see. The Grand Canyon has its own water system of, most, the rest of North American water and elsewhere, but North American waters are rated on a series of 1 to 6. 1 is kind of riffles and 6 is really rough whitewater. Grand Canyon, because of the volume of water and the things that it does, is 1 to 10. It's an entirely different rating. They hadn't seen, as they say, anything yet, but they didn't know about that. In the grinding of the daily work, anybody's familiar with canoeing, portaging, picking up the canoe and taking it around bad rapids, taking all your food around, or lining the boats. And I have a picture of that later somewhere. Lining the boats where you let the painter drift an empty boat down and you walk along the side. Anything so you can really moderate your control of going down the river so you don't hit a rock with problems. So, and this started kind of wearing them out, as you can imagine, their spirits and their backs. The cook tripped and lost all their baking soda, so they ate unleavened bread for the rest of the trip when they had that. And in another instance, they came to midday, they came to a set of rapids that looked like maybe we better check that out. So they pulled over to a very thin bank against a rock wall, little sandy shore, not very deep. And the cook started boiling up some water for coffee. They drank a lot of coffee. And a gust came whooshing down, as we often do, down to the canyon, and lit an eternity's worth of dry brush and firewood. And it burned the painters of the boats, the ropes connecting the bow that they had. They didn't pull it on shore, and caught the men's clothes on fire. And they jumped into the boats and went wheeling around backwards and ass over tea kettle through the rapids that they meant to do. They got down to the end. Miraculously, everybody made that through. But one guy had burned his pants, entirely off. And then another had lost his hair and his eyebrows. Looked pretty funny. So gives you an indication of what these guys were like. They spent about an hour laughing about it and then pulled up their socks and continued on. The next morning, they drank their coffee out of bailing buckets because they had lost most of their cookware. Then came the rains, right? If it wasn't bad enough kind of already. Their clothes really literally began rotting off of their bodies. They made, their boots were coming apart, so they made moccasins. Those started rotting. The worst thing was their flour got soaked. There was nothing they could do about it. And the sun would come out, it would dry, and then it would get wet again. And they took to straining the flour to get the pernicious green, it's a green mold that grows. It's really pretty awful. And each time they did that through their mosquito netting, they would try to, sift it. They would lose more than they saved. You got to remember they had 10 months of supplies, but just within about a month, they were through most of it, right? They were not finding that they couldn't fish. There were no fish. The game that they thought they might supplement their food with were a couple kind of mountain goats, but they were off so far they couldn't get to them. So it was pretty, and everybody then was very familiar with the images and the stories, the graphic stories of the Donner Party. You guys remember the Donner Party, got caught in the past. And what did they do when they ran out of food? So they started thinking about, okay, well, what is this? What is this going to look like? So this was a kind of a tense environment. Tensions grew, as you would imagine, and some was, towards Powell himself. He was the leader. He was a man of iron discipline. He did order people around. They didn't like it all the time, but it was his ironclad leadership that kept him on the focus. Part of the aloofness that they didn't understand was Powell was having this incredible engagement with the environment, with the rock walls, with the geology. They might see these beautiful colors of red and yellow and ochre walls that is beginning to soar over their heads. But Powell, this wasn't just curiosities or, a rainbow turned to rock for Powell. He was watching, he described it as a book, the book of the Earth's past. He had that kind of imagination. Each day, regardless of what was happening, what had happened during the day, he would go off geologizing, he called it, and to look at those rock formations. And you got to remember then that geology was the particle physics of its day, right? Many people then believed in the biblically inspired idea that the Earth was about 6,000 years old. And with that, as you know, came a whole host of assumptions about life and humans' place in it. The science of geology was revealing the idea of deep time, that the Earth's history was not measured in thousands of years, but in millions and maybe many, many millions of years. It was to put it mildly, revolutionary. This would open, among other things, would open up Charles Darwin to the possibility to imagine the theory of evolution. That was just one thing that this opened up that was going to change the world and usher in the modern era. So in this vortex of impassive stone walls that pull them in deeper and deeper into Earth's past, Powell couldn't help but feeling viscerally the irresistible passage of time. Not the diaphanous moments of his life, love and loss, joy and pain that we all know, but the passage of eons, of ages, of entire epochs. On one such his geologizing climbs, and I think we've all been in that at one point, maybe when we were much younger, he found himself climbing up a cliff wall with a friend, and he suddenly realized he had nowhere to go and he was stuck. And he had one arm, as you recall. Even though it was pretty strong, he had no place to go and his grip was slowly easing. Below him lay an 800-foot drop. The man above him was just above him, couldn't reach down to grab him. He looked around for a cactus spine or something to throw down to the man, and Powell was a goner. The last second, this fellow ripped off his long underwear, tossed it over the side, and Powell let go and grabbed it in midair and swung to safety. And they got back together. And according to this fellow, they never talked about it. This is a very famous footprint of what happened in Swinburne's magazine, which everybody in the United States looked at. I just bring this up because it was kind of Victorian modesty, which he's taken off his drawers, but he's still wearing pants. That's modesty of the age. So, like few before him, Powell was beginning to understand how much the Earth had changed. He could see it. Its surface more upheaved, buckled, even bent. And in our lives, the geography largely remains static. We do see erosion and things, but what he was beginning to see was change on a different scale at the Earth, buffeted by cataclysmic volcanic events, by massive inland seas that would leave sediments and then would wash out. So these ancient beaches, by just deep forces that literally bent the rock. And this understanding wrought in the midst of this hellacious, awful expedition would change his life and vault him, and we'll get into this a little bit, into becoming one of America's most famous scientists and would revolutionize the way we looked at the world around. We'll get to that. He had to get home first. After 2.5 months, they finally entered the Grand Canyon itself. They were a pretty sorry bunch at this point. Their boats were just, really more filled with water than they weren't. They would scavenge pine tar and try to fill in holes with those nails that we talked about. Everybody, and their bodies were in bad shape. Everybody bore this list of aggravations: wrenched backs, and sunburn, cuts that wouldn't heal, that would pop open, twisted ankles, terrible boils, skin chewed by mosquitoes, and often just everybody complained of stomachs just chewed up from nerves and too much coffee. They would frequently eat some food that had gone rancid, and they'll sit around and vomit together. I just give you a little bit of that sense, not too much. In the Grand Canyon, has anybody done the Grand Canyon River? Yeah, that's great. Well, when you start into the Grand Canyon at Lee's Ferry, you start with Kaibab limestone. Up here, it's about 250 million year old limestone, and right at your elbow. And over the next 200 miles, these guys would descend 19 distinct layers. I'm not going to get into all of those, but it drops back and back and back in time. It's a cross section of Earth history. Till they reached the so-called basement rock. And it's some of the oldest rock found on Earth's surface. It's one of my favorite ones is that Precambrian Vishnu schist. It's dark and dreamless. It's once laid down by sediments that hardened by immense heat and pressure in the earth, created almost 2 billion years ago. So you start with 250 million years old to 2 billion. 2 billion years ago, that was before oxygen breathing organisms developed on Earth a long time ago. And it's this rock, it's so hard, they create some of the most violent white water that is found on the face of the Earth. They carry their boats around. This is the lining I was telling you about. You've seen that. So they safely put all of their material on the side and they try to put the boats back. This is a very idealistic idea of the Powell group. At this point, they're not looking. It's got us, I guess, but it gives a nice sense of what it's like to kind of line it down. That's why I picked that. So they line their boats. They carried around the worst, and most often they had no choice but to kind of barrel on through. And any pretense now that they were on a scientific mission, barometers were broken, their maps were wet or lost. There was just nothing left. They were now, Powell would later write rather laconically, in a race for dinner. Divides tightened day by day. Each day they were expending more calories than they could. They were down to a quarter of their daily rations. They were dying. And now each of these rapids, and this is current day, of course, but just a sense of what it's like. And when you're in it, it's even worse. But they had a choice. Do we run the river and risk catastrophic encounter with a rock or with a hole, or do we line it and take too much time and carry the boats, which was a terrible burden for them to do. They began to see things in water that few, if any, probably none, had seen before. They encountered whirlpools so strong that it captured the boats and spun them around like a carnival ride. They came up against 15-foot standing waves, skirted and sometimes fell into large gaping holes at the river surface. They were, this is a nice shot when we went down. That's my daughter and my son and Diana there. And I'm not even a very good photographer, but you get a kind of a sense. And we were in a raft that can bounce off rocks. They were buffeted by violent upwelling boils in the water, and later boatmen would give terms to these things: haystacks, pillows, and rooster tails. But for these men, of course, it was all new, and what to do with them was a problem. And in the inner canyon, they came across finally this one set of rapids that even had them that just defied comprehension. They shouted to be heard among the water. Been hard to call it water. It was all foam, spit, and violence. There was no way around it. The walls were sheer. To do a portage would involve lifting the boats up 800 feet up the walls. They didn't have rope that was that long. And then 800 feet down. They were so low on their supplies that this would, if they could have even possibly had the strength to do it, it would take three days, and they would with that run out of food. So they had a lot of conversations about what to do. Three of the men shook their heads, two of them, and said, "No more." And these, again, just to underline, they weren't cowards. They were tough men. They had seen difficult situations, but this was something was too much for them. They liked their chances better to scale the imposing cliffs and strike out across the desert to where they thought there was a Mormon settlement, possibly about 75 miles through the desert. Got to remember, they had no way of carrying their water. They had rifles. They had, but it was iffy. But it was to them less iffy than staying on the water with Powell. Powell talked to them, and he said, I don't know for sure, but for my calculations, we are, we've gone down that, the 6,000 feet. We've done most of it. We're close. They didn't want to hear that. So they all shook hands solemnly, and the three men took off, and our hardy crew, reduced substantially, went to the rapids. And you're going to have to read my book to find out what happened. But needless to say, the river spit out the starving men. There were three at the end when they hit the languid water, came off the plateau. There were three Mormon fishermen who saw this strange sight of these boats coming down, and they could hardly talk. They couldn't stand up. They were so weak. They were so emaciated. They were ghosts. But they were pulled over, and they began to get their strength back. You know, Powell's he's a scientist, so he's not an eloquent writer or too evocative all the time, but he was trying to reach for this idea of what it felt like to go from that crazy rapid and that awful intensity of being trapped with all just water and rock and everything falling apart to what it was like when he came out on the other end. The only experience he could make it kind of was akin to was when he was wounded during the Civil War. I'll just read you this little portion he wrote. When he who has been chained by wounds to a hospital cot until his canvas tent seems like a dungeon cell, until the groans of those who lie about tortured with probe and knife are piled up, a weight of horror on his ears that he cannot throw off, cannot forget, and until the stench of festering wounds and anesthetic drugs has filled the air with its loathsome burden, when he at last goes out into the open field, what a world he sees, how beautiful the sky, how bright the sunshine. They had traveled 1,000 miles in 3 months. Where they started up on the Green River, coming, through all these really wonderful stuff. So the canyon wasn't even a huge part of that, but a pretty impressive part of it. Separation Canyon, this is where those left and came out there. They had a few handfuls of flour and a bag of coffee. And as for those three men who walked out, I think I didn't mention that. I forgot to mention that. Separation Canyon, 24 hours later, they're out of the canyon. So if those guys had waited, because they were never seen again. And it's one of the enduring mysteries of the West. I did some research into it. A lot of people have done research into it. They disappeared entirely, gone. There was thoughts that maybe they had an encounter with some of the Ute Indians, even some Mormons who mistook them, but no sign. There's maybe someone saw someone holding a pocket watch, one of them, bar in a saloon somewhere, but it's all filled with innuendo because there's no explanation. But where they went was pretty rugged country. They didn't make it. It was a bad call on their part. Powell came out. He was this huge hero. You see how he always likes to kind of, face with his other arm the other way. He was claimed as this hero. And at a time after the Civil War, people were so sick of all of that, they wanted heroes. Here he was. So he was on the tip of everybody's tongue with what had happened. He himself felt an abject failure, right? Because he had lost all of his measurements. The whole purpose of going for him had been to map, and to measure, and to do all that. So he set out the next year to do it again. He didn't do it, all of it, and they had a lot more problems, but it's near death things, but they didn't quite finish it. But he got what he wanted: his barometric, his elevations, and his all of the stuff that he needed to make a map to fill in that hole, the last part of the United States that was unknown. From that work, he would start surveying and mapping the rest of the Colorado Plateau. And he would eventually become the leading force and the first serious leader of the United States Geological Survey. And he would help make federal science a permanent part of Washington, the Washington landscape. He would devise the science of geomorphology. Remember, I was telling you could see how the Earth had changed. Well, geomorphology is a study of the formations of Earth and what are those clues that what's happened in the past. And so he gave voice to that science. He would institute the first massive federal science project, the mapping of the entire United States of America. It wouldn't be done until the 1970s, finally, all the topographical maps. All of this is the basic. He realized that if we didn't know what our land was all about, then you couldn't figure out water projects and, highways and all of those things that depend on mapping. He understood that and put that together. He would put together the first large-scale systematic study of native peoples. This is him with a Ute Indian. He was pretty conversant in Ute, and he was very interested in capturing some of native languages before some of the native populations were gone, which was happening very quickly. So he founded the Bureau of American Ethnography at the Smithsonian. He was not a 21st century guy in the sense of he was a person of his time who believed that Anglo-Saxons had hit the pinnacle of the civilized world and the Indians were not. But he did have this terrific interest in what they were about, their language. And he wrote down their oral. This is, you got to remember too, right when the science of anthropology is beginning to happen. And he would go into Navajo. He was invited. It was one of the first white people to be invited into Navajo. Special ceremonies. Interesting guy. It was Powell who's that imagination I'm trying to kind of evoke a little bit. It would enable him to really fundamentally alter our understanding of the American West. Remember I was talking about it, people were kind of looking at America, at the West, to try to figure out what it was. There were no photographs. There were no Zane Grey novels. There were no maps of what that was all like. There were some sparse commentary in magazines about people who had crossed. But they crossed the West to get to the California for the gold rush. They didn't spend a lot of time there. No, it wasn't imagined. American West wasn't imagined. And what Powell did with the Grand Canyon in particular is important to kind of, and I'll spend just a moment on that. The first white men to look at the Grand Canyon were conquistadors in the 1500s. And they took one look. And if you've ever been to the Grand Canyon and you take your first look, it's awe-inspiring. It's terrifying. They ran the other direction. And for the next many hundred years, most people who looked at the Grand Canyon, it's not on a human scale. They all left as fast as they could. What Powell started to write about his experiences in the canyon, he brought photographers there. He brought Thomas Moran, a wonderful portrait a painter. This is one that he brought. It started to give a face to the Grand Canyon. It started to turn the feeling of dread and despair, because the other side of awe, of beauty, is something unsettling, right? It's something unsettling. It started turning into something that was something about the Grand Canyon was a place of exceptionalism, right? Of the American character that was exceptional. That the landscape of America was exceptional at a time when America was really trying to figure all of that out. And it would become, as we know, one of America's most iconic natural features. But you got to remember that didn't happen overnight. But Powell was kind of instrumental in that beginning to change. And at the same time, he didn't stop there. His understanding of Earth always being in flux made him start thinking about the rest of America's development of the West. As America looked towards exploiting Western resources, he began to realize that people had kind of let their imaginations go and had kind of screwy ideas about what the West was all about. It was kind of an Edenic garden. People would write about this garden of the American West, and he knew it wasn't a garden. There were parts of it were very beautiful, but it was largely arid. But Western senators interested in bringing people out west, railroad barons that had spent millions of dollars wanted to develop towns out there, and the West beckoned like that, and few could stop that, not feel the heady pull of manifest destiny, the idea that America's future lay in divinely conferred right of Americans to push across the country and take what it wanted. And it was that optimism that just kind of made people not see the West for what it was. In 1878, Powell met with some of the nation's most elite scientists at the annual meeting of the National Academy of Sciences in Washington. And he unrolled a map, which looks quite simple, but was revolutionary in its implications. The map showed the continental American map, and with a line here that bisects the United States, approximately runs along the 100th meridian, from Texas running north through Kansas, Minnesota, and the Dakotas to Canada. Like I said, generally following the 100th meridian. The line is an isohydrite, and an isohydrite is a rain line. To the right, to the east of that line, the land generally gets 20 inches or more of rain a year. To the west, it generally gets 20 inches or less. Why does that matter? Wait a minute, one more back. Why does it matter? Because you need at least 20 inches of rain to grow crops without irrigation, right? And the development of a lot of this area had been, as America was moving west, was the idea of a quarter section, 160 acres. You were given if you wanted it, and could grow the land and make it work. You could be given a parcel of land and to start your homestead. That was the model that was moving west out in here. And Powell saw that 160 quarter sections were not going to work out there. It was too arid. There wasn't enough water. It was just going to end up with real problems. And this whole concept that he introduced was kind of mind-blowing because it started looking at the United States in an entirely different way. It didn't look at all the states and all of that. It looked at the United States in terms of its climate, and it was revolutionary. I argue that it was revolutionary, an idea as the NASA photos of the fragile orb of Earth were in the 1960s. Help us realize so many things about what our. This is a land, and by the way, you can see this from space. You look down. So he wrote this big, and this is one. He wrote this big, groundbreaking arid lands report, and he said that the development of the West would not work as everybody wanted it to. He insisted that a new overriding plan for developing the nation was necessary, one that took into account the aridity, because he saw, terrible litigation, terrible water loss issues, all of the things we're dealing with today. He virtually listed them in order. This was in the 1880s. In the 1890, can I have the next slide? He unfolded yet another map. I figured he would have loved PowerPoints. This is, as you can tell, here's the 100th meridian, right? Western United States. Looks like somebody shot it with paintball guns. These are each watersheds. And he said, everybody, the best way to think about developing the West is in terms of watersheds, where the water is located and all like that. Keep everything local, keep the big federal government out of it, keep it in local control, this is the way forward. Well, as you can imagine, he got an earful. Life was threatened. Brother, who was a bureaucrat in Washington, D.C., got drummed out of Dodge. He got a torrent of anger at it because people felt that he was standing in the way of progress. Back to that manifest destiny thing. But it was Powell's imagination that enabled him to see beyond the dollars, beyond the inflated words, beyond the jingoism, and that the only way that America could move forward was through thoughtful, sustainable development of American resources. And that would mean really looking at what the land was all about and what it could offer. Its lands and prairies, its forests and water. He thought about he called it fossilized water. These were the underground water aquifers that we know today. He knew that those were limited. And he knew that water was a limited resource. And that we had to be very careful about that. But people didn't want to listen to him a whole lot on that, even though it was registered at what he had said. Visionaries are rarely popular. But his words, of course, as we know today, proved prescient. 30 years after he died in 1902, American senators were doing what they do in America in the Capitol building, and everybody noticed this crazy thing happening. A 10,000-foot tall cloud of dust came into Washington, D.C. It started begriming all the lovely white marble buildings, the windows and all of that. And it slowly dawned on everybody that this was the topsoil from Kansas, Oklahoma, and Nebraska. It had blown off the prairie 1,000 miles to the west because of over-tilling and not taking proper erosion and right. So this was a black duster, they called it. It was the Dust Bowl, displaced 2.5 million people. It was a horrible thing that happened. And it was all because we weren't paying attention, kind of what Powell had, virtually kind of signaled would happen. And his warnings about limited water in the West, Lake Mead has dropped to just, below where it can be sustainable. We're really coming into a crisis about that. Powell always felt optimistic, though, that if we looked at a problem head on, we could change it and we could deal with it. Global climate change wasn't something that anybody at that time knew about, but I sense in a way I read his writings, and I know he was kind of sensing that of the intersection of humans and the environment and the changes that could happen on that. And he would be today out front on that. And I hear the echoes of the people who shouted him down, the same echoes I hear today of people shouting down about climate change is not happening. It's remarkable. It's eerie. But here we are. And I just hope, and I believe in his optimism, and I hope that we won't disappoint his optimism. Time for some questions?
You want to take one or two questions?
Sure.
We're close to time.
Okay. Yes. Yeah. Some guys kept it under their hats. Some lost it all. A lot of people reconstructed it later. Some people reconstructed the trip 30 years later. So what is interesting for somebody like me to deal with is to really patch and figure out and to suss, also if, there were altercations between so some people in their dotage were mad at someone, so we're altering the story. So that's what's exciting for me, is to go into the story like that and begin to look at it. Yes, and they're published in a number of different sources. Yeah.
Sure, a paperback that I read about.
Oh, yeah. Yep.
Figure out these aquifers, these water sources.
Yeah, well, people were beginning to dig, and it was just at the beginning of the combustion engine. So a lot of, they were looking for water, not just on the surface, but they were sticking long pipes down, and they were finding sources of this water that seemed to go on and on and on. Basically, wells, kind of well technology. They were pumping it up with this, and so that, and also the geology that he was figuring out. That there was this fossilized water.
Okay.
Yes.
Financed this first project?
He did, and some of his friends. So it wasn't much. He, got some, as a lot of expedition people do, got people to contribute, even, some of the flour. He got some help with some of the boat and with that cost, Yeah.
I think that's a wrong question.
Oh,
Asking to remove, but
while she's doing that, do you have a question?
Was he congruent enough to actually not be happening out in the west? Because, for example, we now know that 80% of the aquifer water is on cattle ranch. That alone has destroyed the aquifers out west.
Yeah. Yes, he was clear about some of the particular industries that were going to cause more water use and their association. So, it's interesting because, he was in favor of changing the landscape of dams, right? He believed that dams were fine. He would have been horrified, however, to look at any of the huge dams because they just changed the entire landscape in ways that were not, not conducive to, to any kind of balance.
Go as far as stating that just nobody should reside in these particular areas?
I don't know if he was as specific as that, but he did map out where people, where water sources were. So he figured out that the nature of ranches and lands had to be much bigger. So if you were going to give out land, it had to be for much bigger areas that would be more proximate to water sources. And then he began to work that back out, that the Colorado, for instance, like the Colorado River Compact, that there was just limited water doing that. He also realized that there were periodic changes in rainfall, and that he was looking at the long picture, and everybody's going, oh, well, this is really great. Everything's looking good. Well, as we know, there are droughts, and in a year or two, there were terrible droughts for 4 or 5 years that just wiped everything out. So he was looking at this whole kind of continuity of things. Is that question?
Reading out land and going to right now.
Yeah. Of course.
yeah, what's that?
All right.
I don't know if there's a.
Okay.
John, thank you so much. This has just been fascinating. I too have read the book and I've recommended it to several people. It's a great read. It's an amazing story of exploration under incredible obstacles and really a fascinating portrait of a very forward-looking John Wesley Powell. So I would recommend the book. It's really a page turner. I want to introduce myself. I'm Catherine Nelson. I'm also a member of the Board of Trustees of the library. Thank you all for attending tonight in person or virtually. And I hope you enjoyed John's comments. Tonight's program is just one of many programs the library is offering this summer. We have a great roster of speakers and programs. Please take a look at the library website to get a little bit more information on the upcoming speakers. I do want to highlight 2 people who will be coming up in the next few weeks. 2 weeks from tonight, on August 9th, we have Suzette McAvoy, who is going to be speaking to us about the collection at the Farnsworth. She's the curator at the Farnsworth, and she'll be here speaking to us just like this, a hybrid event, In person, pre-registrations required, and also by Zoom. And then on August 11th, Thursday, August 11th, we have Karen Miller Pensiero speaking, and she's the managing editor of the Wall Street Journal. And she'll be talking to us about the journal's exit from Afghanistan last year, how they removed reporters and their news associates from Afghanistan, and then the subsequent events of this past year. She will be speaking on the church lawn across the street. If you have any trouble pre-registering or have any questions about the upcoming programs, please just stop by the library, come into the circulation desk, and the staff will be happy to help you. Now, the library relies on your support for programs like this. If you are a current donor to the library, we greatly appreciate your support. 100% of your donations support ongoing library operations. If you're not a current donor, then please consider the library when you make your charitable donations. We rely on all of our donors to provide services and programs to the entire community throughout the year. So I look forward to seeing you at some of the upcoming events, and thank you for coming tonight.
And if you buy a book, part of that goes to the library.
Oh, thank you. I didn't know that.
Buy a book. I'm happy to sign books too. I do. Should I do it?
Yeah.
Want my picture? Want to write it?
Well,